Recording on one. Okay, so we're recording now. Three, two, one.
You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
What happens when you want to litigate war? What happens when you want to understand how a country goes to war? Who decides they can go to war and how do they legally make that decision? Why are lawyers everywhere? G'day listeners and welcome to the Dead Prussian podcast. I'm your host Mick, the humblest host there is, and as you know, I've been quite busy in the podcasting space, so there's been a bit of a delay between episodes. I don't apologise for that because we've brought War for Idiots back. That's right, the idiots have returned. Whether it is for good or ill, I'll let you decide. But the fact is, they're back. So make sure you jump over to War for Idiots and check it out. Don't give them more stars than this podcast, but maybe 4 stars for them, 5 stars for us. I'll be quite happy with that. Also want to thank everyone who has subscribed to the Dead Prussian social media network. That's right, our own little community, the TDP community. Jump on the website www.thedeadprussian.com, sign up and hang out with listeners, talk about really cool stuff like law in war. Now, from my intro, you probably guessed I've got an aversion to lawyers. That's not true. In my previous career, they kept me out of a lot of trouble, especially in the targeting world. But it does stand to reason that law and war go together. Not just because both seem to be portrayed as very combative activities in pop culture, but because in liberal democratic societies anyway, and I apologise to all my listeners who live in totalitarian states or authoritarian states who don't really get a choice or a legal say, in liberal democracies it's important that war is conducted in accordance with the laws of the country. Now, we've talked about just war, we've talked about ethics a lot on this show, but I don't think I've ever had an expert on law in war on the show. That's about to change. My guest today is Associate Professor Catherine Bond. She researches the relationship between law and war in Australia and Australian legal history. She has published widely in leading Australian and international law journals on topics ranging from crown copyright to plain packaging of tobacco products to the introduction of a patent system in the Game of Thrones world of Westeros. Catherine's first book, Anzac, The Landing, The Legend, The Law, was published by Australian Scholarly Publishing in 2016. Her work on the legal regulation of Anzac, that's the term Anzac, I'm doing air quotes, you just can't see them, has been featured in the Sydney Morning Herald and on the Law Report, The World Today, and Saturday Extra. Her second book, Law in War, Freedom and Restriction in Australia during the Great War, was published by New South Books in April 2020. Catherine, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Mick. I'm really happy to be here. This is actually my first proper podcast recording, and I'm really glad to be here on the Dead Prussian and not like a subject of a true crime podcast, for example. So very happy to be here.
I'm glad we could make your first appearance on a podcast be something other than a true crime podcast. They are everywhere, and I wish people would stop voting for them in podcast awards because it's just voyeurism put to an audio track.
And there's enough of that on the TV.
There is enough of that on the TV. Mind you, I do love a good crime drama. Now, Catherine, before we start discussing law in war, particularly the First World War or the Great War, or if you are American, World War I, horrible term, I am keen to hear about how you became interested in studying war law.
So like a lot of your listeners and like a lot of your past guests, I guess I had the kind of traditional Australian introduction to the world wars through high school modern history, but I have to admit that I can't say it was particularly inspiring or particularly really stayed with me all that much. I had an interest in the military and in the world wars, probably from things like reading the Diary of Anne Frank and from seeing films like Saving Private Ryan. But it wasn't really till I started my PhD that I actually started to look at these things a little bit more closely. So in my PhD, that was on part of that was on Australian legal history in copyright. And I was doing work at the National Archives. Actually, it was the first time I ever went to the National Archives, and I found these documents that talked about copyright or extending the term of copyright for Australian and Belgian soldiers and having like a reciprocal arrangement for these soldiers. And that is really pretty mundane, basically. But it started me thinking about the fact that, well, in war, obviously, things are going to have to change with people's legal rights and their legal privileges and those types of things. And in about 2012, I started a project that looked at intellectual property, which is the area that I'm trained in, about intellectual property being used as a weapon of war. So how governments have used IP to benefit their war efforts. And as part of that work, I started to look into the regulation of Anzac, which led to my first book. And one of the things that I really found interesting in doing that work was how there hadn't really been a lot of talk about law in conflicts or law in nations during conflicts, but also the experiences of people and how people's lives were impacted by war during these conflicts. And so that became one of my motivations, basically telling these stories about how people experienced law during these wars, people who often many times wouldn't have encountered law at all in their lifetime.
It's quite fascinating because it's not something most people would come into contact with or understand as even being an issue, is this concept of, you know, how is the law involved? I mean, most people don't really most people, I suggest there's probably a fair few people out there as well that do understand how the law affects their lives every day. I mean, we're all aware of it now in these COVID times.
Definitely.
But the previously, you know, it's the 20% of the people that are sort of having contact with law on a regular basis. I'm not going to go back to what I learnt in my criminology degree because I'll get all the stats wrong and I'll have Griffith University revoke my criminologist license. But you've recently released a book with New South Books. Great people at New South Books. I talk to them quite a bit actually through both my day job and also the podcast. And the book's called Law in War, which is kind of good because there's a lot of us that, you know, can use that to talk about our parents-in-law. But are you able to give us an overview of the book?
So the book itself, it documents and examines the legal experiences of a range of people who lived during World War. Oh, I was about to say World War One. Apologies.
Oh, it's all
Is
right.
there a buzzer?
The American audience will
there's
probably get to the episode first, so it's okay.
During the First World War, sorry, I use them interchangeably. So it looks at and explores how people interacted with law during the First World War and how it impacted upon their lives. So each chapter focuses on an individual or a series of individuals who were impacted by law in some way during the First World War. And it has chapters on Billy Hughes and Robert Garran, who were responsible for writing the laws, a police officer of German ancestry, Frederick Sickedick, who enforced the laws, a number of men who were interned, number of German-born men who were interned, Franz Wallach and Carl Lude, women who were protesting the law and were imprisoned, men who were deported, men who were discriminated against. So a whole range of individuals, and how, if in many cases, if war hadn't occurred, they probably wouldn't have come into contact with the law at all during their lifetimes.
Yeah. Okay. So it's not so much litigating lethality, which is actually what I'm going to use as the tagline for that this episode, because I think that's an excellent tagline.
It's beautiful, yeah, definitely.
But it's more about, you know, the way the law has affected the lives of those also affected by the war. And I mean, we've had episodes on the show before of understanding how the other were affected during both the First and Second World Wars. In fact, I went on a big rant about don't alienate, demonise the other. And not too many people listened to that because very shortly after that, COVID hit, and look what happened there. But
there's a bit going on, yeah.
That's right. There's a little bit of that. Now you focus on Australian law in the First World War, or World War One, which is probably not the best for some of our listeners to say. There's a lot of British academics out there hating on me right now, but that's okay.
No, look,
let's lean into the skid. Let's lean into the skid. So in World War One, you focus on Australian law, and I guess I really want to know what Australian law was like related, law related to war. Please don't tell me about patent law. I deal with enough intellectual property at work, but
but I can. We did have a whole statute around that in the First World War.
Excellent, that's brilliant. But as long as it's related to war, right? Like we're okay with that.
Yeah, no problem.
I don't want to hear about something that's not related to war, but is law, because I'm sure it's exciting for you. So what was it?
I can go for hours on patent law and manner of manufacture. No worries.
That would be excellent. You can review my next contract. So Australian law related to war in the early 20th century. What was it like?
So one of the first acts actually passed by the Australian Parliament after Federation was the Defence Act. It was created in 1903. And it set up the basics of Australia's military, essentially. And over the kind of next 11 years before the outbreak of World War One, the First World War, that act was amended in a number of different ways, possibly most significantly from my perspective, were changes made around who was exempted from military service. And this is really important because it impacts who could actually enlist. Right. This was actually really discriminatory. So on the one hand, this new section that came in 1910, it exempted members of Parliament, the judiciary, police officers, ministers of religion, for example. But it also created this specific exemption for men who were not substantially of European origin or descent. So
it's a terribly racist term.
It is, it absolutely was. And the provision was then used from the outset of the First World War to discriminate against men seeking to serve their country but were excluded because they were, for example, of Chinese descent. Yep. They might have had a Chinese parent, for example. I talk about one individual in the book who fell into that category, or Indigenous Australians as well. Yep. Now, we know that these men were eventually able to serve, but there was this provision in the Defence Act that really entrenched that white Australia policy culture of the time and ultimately had a big impact on who was able to enlist. When war eventually broke out, though, the Australian government had to introduce a whole new legal regime, essentially, to deal with the management of the legal consequences of war in Australia. Okay. And that started with the War Proportions Act in October 1914.
Wow, the War Proportions Act. Nothing could get me more excited than the name of that. We should have the COVID Proportions Act.
I think we're past that.
Well, we've got a lot of the special ministerial advice and decisions. I don't know if have we got much legislature apart from the. Actually, this is not about COVID. Let's move on.
But I can answer that question. It's for another podcast, though.
Yeah, that's right. We'll have to start up the dead lawyer or something like that.
The dead lawyer.
That's quite morbid, isn't it?
There's a lot of ways this could go.
Now, some of the key introductions or revisions of Australian war law during this period, you talked about a little bit about it before, internment, deportation. We talked about the racism thing, which is quite funny when you look at the greatest sniper at Anzac Cove was Billy Singh. Singh was not it's not name from Yorkshire.
No.
What are some of the other key introductions to or revisions of Australian war law during this period?
So I think one of the things that's really striking about the law during this period is simply how restrictive and how broad it was. So there were provisions around, there were obviously, as soon as the war broke out, within a week, the government had introduced restrictions around what German citizens who were living in Australia could and couldn't do. They had to register at their local police station. If they changed their address, they had to re-register. Under regulations passed in relation to aliens, all men of who were German in the German military or reservists in Australia could be arrested and interned. And I think we're familiar to a certain extent, or when people think about the First World War and perhaps law, they know that these kind of specific provisions around enemy subjects, so to speak, existed. But with law in the First World War, it's amazing actually how broad it was. So there were restrictions on everything from selling goods at a price higher than was set by regulations. Mm-hmm. You couldn't sell goods that had been provided to you by the Red Cross. You couldn't pretend to be a returned soldier. You couldn't wear a military uniform with insignia that it was not of your rank. Yes. You couldn't sell military badges. You couldn't sell military uniforms. You could be prosecuted for tearing down recruiting posters. You could be prosecuted for making statements likely to prejudice recruiting. And that was used to catch everyone from a man in a Victorian fruit shop through to newspaper publishers. So there were a lot of provisions around censorship. But even publishing a newspaper or a publication where censorship, showing censorship had occurred, you didn't get rid of the white space where matter had been taken out. You could be prosecuted for that. Through to everything like the introduction in 1916 of the restriction of the use of Anzac as the name of a business or as the name of a home, for example. So it was the date, it wasn't, we think of law in war as really affecting, like you mentioned, the idea of the other. But the laws in World War I Australia had an impact on everyone, day-to-day individuals, everyone from bakers through to newspaper publishers through to fathers and mothers whose sons were serving overseas.
Well, it's quite an extensive bunch. I do like the idea that you can comply with the censor but still be arrested if it looks like you've complied with the censor.
Yes, yeah, and these kind of there's a case of a socialist newspaper editor, Robert Ross, who was prosecuted under the War Precautions Regulations. He then printed an account of his prosecution in his newspaper, and he was prosecuted again for reporting on his own prosecution.
Brilliant.
That went to the High Court of Australia. There was a lot going on.
I mean, because in Australia, the one of the most recent iconic moments for Australian print news, because sadly we don't have too many more iconic moments in Australian print anymore, but was when Cardinal Pell was first convicted and they put up the censored thing, something big happened we just can't tell you about. That was brilliant, and I'm kind of glad they didn't get arrested for that. So it's interesting. Like I just really like the idea of that. I was prosecuted. Now I'm going to be prosecuted for telling you I was prosecuted, and then if I leave this page blank, so you can get the hint. It's just these.
Even more trouble. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah. And someone who writes a socialist newspaper is arrested during a time when the markets have to sell goods at a price below a regulated price.
Yes, and paper is regular. Even paper is regulated at that time too. Yeah.
They should have outlawed hypocrisy and seen where they were after that. It's all right. They were trying to do their best. Now, look, there are some interesting personalities in this area. You've mentioned. I'm gonna mute you while I say this so that no one can tell if you're laughing or not, because I'm known for being crass, but my guests aren't. But Snickerdick is someone's name, so that is hilarious. But there's also, you talk about Billy Hughes and a range of other key personalities. Who were some of the main personalities in the debate revision introduction of these laws?
So the key central person, without a doubt, was the little digger, Billy Hughes. He was the Attorney General from September 1914 onwards. So when the First World War actually broke out, there was a Liberal government in power. Then there was an election in September 1914. The Labor Party replaced the Liberal Party in power, and Billy Hughes became the Attorney General. And later, in October 1915, as we know, he became the Prime Minister.
Yeah.
So it's really, for me, kind of crystal ball thinking is to wonder what would have happened, how different things would have been, how different things would have been if Billy Hughes hadn't been in power, hadn't had such control during this period. Because he was really responsible for the central laws made during this time. Yeah. He really saw law as one of the tools that he could use to attain victory in law, basically. And so in the Attorney General's Department, he was assisted by Robert Garran, who was who had been in the Attorney General's Department since it was first created in 1901. Yeah. And he was the secretary and responsible for the drafting of the majority of these laws. And when he retired, he wrote in 1932 that he boasted of how quickly he would create these regulations. So one day he was called to Sydney by Billy Hughes, and once he got there, in the space of 15 minutes, he was required to draw up regulations relating to the creation of the Commonwealth Police Force after the infamous Warwick Egg incident. It occurred in late 1917, and within that 15 minutes, he also drafted up laws to disenfranchise naturalised enemy subjects. So these were the two key men responsible for the drafting of the laws during this time. Yeah. Now, originally there was bipartisan support, understandably, for the War Precautions Act. I know your favourite piece of wartime legislation.
It is, it is.
Can't get enough of it. So originally there was bipartisan support for the legislation, but as the war progressed and these restrictions were introduced, and these were often introduced not within Parliament but just by the executive, so they didn't need parliamentary approval. As that continued and life became more restrictive and controlled, that bipartisan support went away. It was as early as April 1915 that politicians from both within the Liberal and Labor Party were saying, there needs to be more accountability here. We also had the High Court during this period as well, but they also were very tame, to be honest, despite the fact that they were one of the few legal avenues for individuals to challenge, for example, internment or challenge these laws. The same 7 men sat on the court for the duration of the First World War, and in nearly every case that came before them about the war precautions or other legislation, they would say, look, it's not up to us to determine the wisdom of this law. We're just here to figure out if it's legal or not under the Constitution. They refused to pass judgment on the laws themselves. And so that led to that led to a situation where the War Precautions Act and the many regulations and restrictions passed under it thrived, basically, under Billy Hughes.
Oh, brilliant. Oh, yeah, good to have a high court. Thanks, guys.
Yeah. They were a bit more proactive in the Second World War, but the First World War, they was very quiet. But then, which was interesting because a number of the sitting judges actually had sons who were serving overseas.
Yeah.
3 of the judges actually lost sons, and it's an interesting consideration about whether, their own personal sacrifices ultimately influence what they thought, or whether they thought that there were limits on what war should or shouldn't be able to do during this time.
Yeah, and I guess, the laws that they were asked to do and deal with were the laws they were asked to do. That's terrible phrasing. The laws they were asked to deal with were related to the home front, right? So I guess if you're losing your sons, you're probably going to stick by whatever needs to be done to win the war effort. And I guess I recently read a great piece of fiction about the Second World War, but it's also got elements of the First World War, written by an Australian author, Nigel Featherstone. He actually wrote it while in residence at UNSW Canberra, and he, one of the themes on that is a political father who's keen for one of his sons to go away in the war because he saw how people in places, high places, reputations were bolstered if their sons were away serving the patriotic cause. Because that's kind of the time we lived in. Now, talking about time, it's time for us to go to the bonus question for our subscribers. Now, subscribers are the people that throw us a little tin. So, listeners, if you don't pay us any money, you don't get to listen to the bonus question, which is really, really good for me, really, really bad for you. It is really, really good also for our subscribers that do pay us some money because it is the best question I ever ask on a show, probably. All right, so we'll just have a quick pause. And now we're back, listeners. That was an amazing answer to an amazing question. I would have hated to have missed out on that. We'll go on to the final question, though. And now this is what I sometimes call the butcher's bill when I'm talking about the First World War because it's such a close term to that type of war. My butcher's bill for guests coming on the show. Now, it relates to our mission on the show, which is to define war in as many ways as possible, just like Big Carl, the dead Prussian himself, did, so that we can continue the debate in society about war, and really, I guess, relates very strongly to this topic and what we are willing to do as a society around war to achieve those aims and whether or not it is worth the cost. So I asked each guest to finish the sentence, war is. So, Kate, I ask you to finish the sentence, war is.
War is not the appropriate analogy for the current pandemic.
That is amazing. You must have been listening to my previous episodes of like the War for Idiots. I hate the metaphor. I like to say war is not your metaphor. Brilliant.
Yeah.
That is excellent. And listeners must be feeling this quite closely. And also, I didn't like the war and bushfires analogy here in Australia. So for those listeners who are not aware, the southeastern part of the continent was on fire this year. Probably
that pretty well captures
easiest way to describe it. And people also use the same sort of metaphors they're using for COVID-19, the war metaphor. And as Kate has remarked, and as many of my listeners know, war is something very, very specific and unique of its own. And it is not. It's not the analogy or the metaphor you're looking for. If you need to mobilise society, find something else. That's a great definition. Look, Kate, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Now, listeners, that was Dr. Kate Bond from UNSW talking about her new book, Law in War. I want to thank everyone for listening. I want to thank everyone for all your support. And I also want to thank all those listeners out there who are staying home, who are doing the right things during this COVID-19 pandemic. And I want to ask my US listeners, what are you doing? And for everyone else, keep doing it. Right, if you need to feel something to read while you're in the pandemic, you can find Kate's book. Jump into the show notes. I've got a link there. Go to Amazon, buy it. If you buy it from Amazon, we get a little bit of a kickback, maybe 50 cents, maybe $50. I'll give you a hint. It's probably something like 10 cents. And you also get an awesome book. Jump on there, buy Kate's book, support her. And more importantly, if you want to follow Kate on Twitter at Dr. Kate Bond, that's Doctor abbreviated the normal way, Katebond. You will find she has lots of interesting topics to discuss, and many of them about law and war. And for those listeners that are looking for something a little bit extra in their life, jump on thedeadprussian.com, click on the TDP community, join our social network, come hang with us. We do writing workshops, we do book club, we do Roman history, we do everything the type of person you think listens to this show would like to do on a social network that's not owned by Zuckerberg. All right, that's all I've got time for tonight, listeners. So until next time, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at the Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.